Hello, and welcome to the 52nd episode of NEOHUMAN podcast. I'm Agah Bahari, a Dogologist, on Instagram and Twitter, and you can follow the show on liveinlimbo.com, iTunes, and YouTube, as well as BitChute. And today with me, I have a pleasure of having Erik Davis. Welcome to a NEOHUMAN with Agah Bahari, Erik. It's a pleasure to have you. Let's start with your background, the work you've done, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Well, that's a long story because I got enough years under my belt. Basically, I've been a freelance writer and independent scholar for my life. And though I did recently get my PhD a few years ago, and my latest book, High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, Visionary Experience in the '70s, is based on my dissertation about three oversized characters in the 1970s: the mushroom bard Terence McKenna, the Illuminati satirist Robert Anton Wilson, and the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. And so I've been interested in the counterculture, the underground, alternative religion, psychedelics, esotericism, the occult, Eastern religion, all the weird stuff. And it's kind of became my beat early on in the 1990s when I wrote a lot for the Village Voice. I also wrote a lot about music back in the day. I was a rock critic, more or less, and but then I kind of got more into these other currents, as well as technology. Not so much the business side of the story as the cultural side of the story, which was really quite interesting and fascinating in the 1990s, and not so grim and gloomy as it is today. So I don't write quite as much about technology as I did then, although I do consider myself kind of a futurist. I'll from an unusual angle.
Excellent. And you have a new book called High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the '70s. Tell us a little about your book, High Weirdness, and what made you write High Weirdness at this time?
I've been interested in these guys for a long time, particularly Philip K. Dick. I wrote my senior thesis in the 1980s at Yale on Philip K. Dick at a time when nobody was really paying attention to him. You know, a few science fiction scholars, but he wasn't famous. I mean, people knew about Blade Runner, but they thought about the film. They didn't really care that much about Philip K. Dick. It was before there were a lot of movies made based on his work, before he sort of had a revival in the 1990s. And I was kind of part of actually making that revival happen because I wrote a lot about him in the late '80s and 1990s. So I've been wrestling with Dick's work for a long, long time. And initially, this project was just going to be about him and his so-called religious experience. In 1974, these series of remarkable quasi-paranormal, quasi-psychotic, quasi-mystical events that happened to him and really conditioned, the last part of his life and his work. All of his final writings are in some way relating to these series of experiences. And so I had been able to work on some of his writings at that time, and particularly he wrote this enormous private diary called the Exegesis, where he called the Exegesis. And this was not published during his life, and nor really intended to, but he, remained afterwards, and I was part of the team that helped edit that into something. So I'd been working with Dick's work for a long time, and I was thinking about this experience. How do we talk about psychotic slash occult slash religious experiences, especially in the era of the 1970s, which I think is a really significant era. We can talk a little bit more about that later, because I think it relates to today in some really, really important ways. But I was also just always interested in the era, and so I started thinking about, like, well, how can I tell Dick's story against the backdrop of the 1970s. And as I was doing that, I realized that there were other people who went through not terribly dissimilar kinds of experiences in different situations. And I decided to choose two of those, Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson, and kind of compare and contrast, although I ended up doing less of that than I had hoped to. I ended up just kind of providing different accounts of these three guys, but again, they had very interestingly similar experiences. There were elements of science fiction, cybernetics, of futurism, but as well as religious and occult imagery, the paranormal, and also a kind of ambiance of gutter culture, of a sort of underground ferment.
Have you ever end up meeting up Philip K. Dick with Terence McKenna? Bless you.
Thank you. Did I meet them?
No, no, no. Have they ever end up meeting each other, Philip K. Dick and Terence
Yeah,
McKenna?
they actually all knew each other. I don't believe that Terrence. I don't know. Terrence did not meet PKD. PKD did meet Robert Anton Wilson, but they were aware of each other's work. Like PKD wrote about The Invisible Landscape, the book that Terrence wrote with his brother Dennis in 1975. He wrote about that in the exegesis and in some of his letters, so he was familiar with their ideas. And then Terrence later on, again, fairly early in the revival of Dick, there was an early kind of set of excerpts from the exegesis that was published called In Pursuit of Valis. And Terrence wrote an introduction to that where he was basically saying, what happened to Dick was what happened to me. The same thing happened, because he wanted to sort of make the connection. Whereas Robert Anton Wilson, even though, again, there are these similarities, he was like, well, there's some similarities between me and Dick, but a lot of differences too, which is more of a kind of Robert Anton Wilson way of approaching it because he's such a pluralist. He recognizes all these kind of different kind of things that are going on in any given situation.
And the experiences that PKD had, were they with any specific kind of hallucinogenic, or it was across the board? He was just experimenting with different kind of drugs and had different kind of experiences.
No, that's actually a good question because in many ways it happened sort of outside of the direct context of drugs. Now, in the 1960s, Philip Dick did try LSD and mescaline. There's a handful of experiences, and they were important to him. He referred to them. Some of them were quite nightmarish, and some of them definitely anticipated some of his 70s experiences and the imagery. He had a famous early trip where he ends up speaking Latin and, intoning these terms from a Bach piece. And, these sort of set up some of the Christian themes that come up in his later religious experience. But he was mostly a speed user starting in the late 1950s, but really ramping up in the early 1960s, carrying through the whole decade, like lots and lots, brain damaging amounts of speed. But by the early 1970s, he went through a kind of almost a kind of death and rebirth thing. He bottomed out in Canada and it wound up in a rehab clinic, a really intense rehab clinic. And after that point, he kind of turned his back on the counterculture. He didn't stop taking everything. I think he still smoked weed sometimes, and he may have had one or two psychedelic trips that just kind of fell in there. But he kind of was out of that intense drug culture and had been for a number of years when these experiences happened. So you could say, well, he was already brain damaged. But frankly, the thing about Dick is that if you go back into his biography, and his early biography particularly, he was always non-neurotypical. I mean, he had a different reality. He was wrestling with psychological symptoms. Were they psychotic? Were they paranoid? Were they schizophrenic? Who knows? Because all of those things are moving targets. And he was diagnosed really early. He started to see shrinks when he was very young. He started to take psychiatric drugs when he was very young. He took tons of psychiatric drugs. So he was always a sort of mix of unpredictable psychological symptoms and drugs, legal and illegal, and whatever. So it's very hard to say where drugs stopped and Philip K. Dick started. But at the same time, it's really important to emphasize that unlike McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson, who are both very consciously taking large doses of psychedelics in order to see how far out they could get, Dick was not doing that. He was not experimenting that way. In fact, if anything, he was taking massive doses of vitamin C because he thought that was going to do something. And maybe it did. Who knows? So he was kind of a druggy guy, but he wasn't like pedal to the metal on the actual substance use at the time that he had these experiences.
It's like what they're saying, that the difference between insanity and genius is so thin and blurry that sometimes people can't really tell the difference between the two.
I mean, Dick is a better example of that than anyone, in my view. Even his books, like his greatest books, there's something a little fractured about them.
Hmm.
The writing isn't completely smooth all the way through. There's this sort of frenetic energy, and sometimes there's these jump cuts, and you're like, where did that come from? Or some rough elements in them. And I kind of feel like, I mean, one of the great things about reading Dick is that you get to sort of enter into a mind that has an element in it that is psychosis or that is sort of, mentally unstable. And yet he not only compensates for it, but he kind of weaves it into his story, on this sort of deeper level. And you're kind of with him as he's processing it personally and telling all these amazing stories. And these stories just came from his head like just he just could spew them out. He wrote most of his books, which are pretty intensely plotted. There's multiple characters. The plots don't always quite hold up, but they're very dense and rich. And he wrote most of his early books in one sitting. He just sat down and had a bunch of notes, some ideas, and he would just boom, 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 sometimes in a week or 2 weeks, like a whole book. So he had an unusual capacity to tell stories and to weave together networks of characters in a way that I think is really singular and quite brilliant. And yet there's a way in which his brilliance is woven into his psychosis, which some of his less good books, you can almost feel it. It's not just that they're not very well written. It's that you're kind of in the presence of some process that's unnerving to you and the author.
Different kind
And
of context, I guess.
yeah, for sure.
We are talking to Erik Davis. It's a pleasure to speaking with him. He has a new book called High Weirdness, Drug, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s, and it's been published by the MIT Press. You mentioned that you want to talk less about summary of your book because you've been doing it for a while now. The book came out in June or July, and and I found it really interesting that you mentioned you would be interested to talk about how has your experience has been talking about the book on different kind of setups and different kind of podcasts. Would you like to talk a little about that?
Yeah, sure. No, it's actually been more illuminating than I thought it would be. If you talk about a project you did, oftentimes it gets a little like, oh yeah, I'm telling the same story. And I didn't want to just keep telling the same story. So I started to go into what was maybe a deeper interest on mine. Like, what was it about the 1970s that really interested me? And initially I would talk about, I was born in the 60s, so the 1970s is the first sort of cultural era that shaped me. I remember things about the early 1970s when I was a little kid and certain records my parents had and, television commercials and, and pop music and stuff from that era. So it's always really interested me, particularly the kind of dark spookiness, because it's a very strange time in American history and in a lot throughout the world in a lot of ways, but definitely in American history because it was kind of the first, major bummer era of America, which is sort of pathologically optimistic, at least until recent decades. And the 70s was the first real wow, this is a bummer, and so I was really interested in that period. But as I talked about the book, I realized that a lot of ways what interested me was the similarities between that era and our era today. That if we look back at American history and go, where is a time that we're going to find some of the same concerns and fears and obsessions and fantasies and paranoias and the same sort of psychic ambiance that we have today? What's the closest to where we are? It's definitely the 1970s, and particularly the early 1970s. Strong degree of social polarization. There were worries about the environment and energy, pollution. There was the terrorist became a really significant figure with all of the hijackings. That was the kind of dominant form of terrorism, as well as some of the bloodier gangs in America and other places where people were actually dying. I mean, in some ways, it was a lot more frightening because there was even more domestic terrorism than there is today, although albeit from the left rather than from the right, which is what we have today. And there was also just kind of a cultural malaise. There was a sense of drifting, of being unsure, as well as a degree of paranoia. some of our great films of paranoia are from the early 1970s, like The Parallax View or The Conversation. And anybody watching these films, even though the technology is all analog, and it's not always about technology, it's about politics too, anyone watching today would feel like a similar kind of like creeping suspicion that there's sort of dark shadow behind us, watching us, shaping us, that kind of sense of paranoia that, is partly related to conspiracy theory. The 70s was also a big period for conspiracy theory. And indeed, that's what Robert Anton Wilson's, in some ways his most famous book is about. In 1975, he published this book called Illuminatus, that had been written over the previous sort of 5 or 6 years from the late 60s on. And it's this big satirical romp. It's this funny, messy, goofy, pulp fiction, brilliant exegesis. It's just this mishmash book. But the driving themes of it are sort of the idea that like all conspiracies are true. And the main conspiracy is about the Illuminati, who, again, are, feature heavily in today's conspiracy stories. And he was sort of taking the piss out of it, but he was also kind of getting into it. And indeed, the book has a weird quality, and I mean that term specifically, that it kind of looks like a satire. He's just making fun of stuff. He's just having fun as a writer with his writing partner, Robert Shea. They co-wrote the book. But you can also kind of tell he's sort of getting into it, and he's starting to recognize that there's real similarities between, let's say, thinking about conspiracies and thinking in terms of the occult or mysticism. And it's no accident that today both conspiracy theory and occultism, including astrology and, psychic healing and all this kind of stuff, is on the rise again, because there's something about when you enter difficult political periods, some of these stories become more salient, they become more powerful. And so as I was talking about high weirdness over the months, and I had all these great conversations, a lot of interest in podcast land. And it's a very satisfying thing as a writer these days. If you put out a book that's interesting, even if it doesn't sell that well or doesn't get any recognition from the mainstream, there's usually a whole world of people who are interested in it. So you get to talk about it and meet readers that way. And, it's a wonderful thing about the podcast ecology, which to my mind is one of the most positive, hopeful things in our current kind of information environment. But anyway, as I was talking about this stuff over the months, I started to talk more and more about contemporary politics and our contemporary situation. Like it was less about, let's go back to the 70s and enjoy all these specific details. I mean, that's all in the book, and anybody who's interested in that period would get a lot out of just the general discussion of that era. But my own shift is to sort of recognize how relevant these things are today. And I'll give you one example that was really a nice confirmation. The current issue of New York Magazine. And if you're, listeners, it's worth it to open up the image.
I'm showing it to them
cover
right now.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
The weirdness is coming. So one, they use the term, and we haven't talked about the term weirdness now, but let's do it next. But I'll bookmark it for now.
Yeah.
The weirdness is coming. It's about the next 10 years, and it's prediction, like kind of futurism, but not in sort of that usual kind of technocratic way of saying, in the future we'll have these kinds of new technologies and new problems as well. Instead, it's like, whoa. Things are about to get really weird, guys. Like you're going to be afraid of the wind, and malls are going to become massive interactive theme parks. Weird, or actually, we're not really science fiction people. We're increasingly becoming like medieval peasants who don't own anything, and we're like these digital serfs, and so it's a little more fantastic. It talks about how science fiction is going to be hard to write because we're going to be living it. But even more than the fact that they're using weirdness to talk about the future and the kind of weirdness of the future, not just its scariness or its problems, but that quality of the weird, which is sort of unnerving, it's kind of mystical, it's not really rational, it's poetic, it has a certain feeling, but it's also kind of disturbing. You don't want to live there. And in a way, that's our increasingly our general condition. But it's the cover. The cover art that they chose, which is why I asked you to it's great you're showing it, is deeply 70s. Like I can like go to my bookshelves and pull out a dozen paperback titles with pictures just like that, including Carlos Castaneda books. So like kind of the epitome of like psychedelic shamanic weirdness in the 1970s. They have covers that are just this kind of style. And so for me, that cover was a strong confirmation that this sense of the 70s and the sense of weirdness was very applicable and resonant with our contemporary moment in a very literal kind of way.
Now, the connection just that came to my mind. I'm doing a Monday to Thursday live stream called Beyond Good and Evil. And the main theme of that is how we have moved from centralized structures of authorities, or we're moving from them towards a decentralized kind of a world that has been possible by internet and smart devices. And what the similar thing between what you were saying about the 70s and right now, it seems to me to be to breaking the monopoly on distribution of information and interpretation of information. And it's really interesting because America had gone through the first psychedelic revolution in the late 60s, right? And the 70s was kind of getting stuff back together to create some kind of an order. And exactly because of that kind of an uncertainty, a lot of awesome things happen and a lot of horrible things happen.
Yeah, no, I think you're really right on there. I would characterize what happened in the 70s a little bit differently, and I talk about that specifically in the sort of the first chapter of the book, where I kind of lay out the 70s. And one of the main things that happens is precisely what you're talking about, which is a shift towards pluralism. That in the early it's not the 1960s, it's in the early 70s when not just avant-garde groups of countercultural people, but the society as a whole stepped towards a multi-centered, multicultural world. I mean, in our views today, maybe not multicultural enough, but for that time, quite radically, where institutions started to acknowledge different identity positions, different sexual orientations, different genders. There was more, the Black Power movement had opened up a space where now Native Americans started, grabbing a slice of the pie. Chicanos started grabbing a slice of the pie. So suddenly we're in a world where there's more different kinds of ways to be. And I use a phrase, I call it the centrifugal self. And it's the idea that the self used to kind of orbit around a central source of authority, and that authority broke down, at least for everybody who wasn't in the silent majority or the conservative or the Bible Belt side of America in the 1970s. So that authority breaks down, and then suddenly, whoa, you're in this immense centrifuge moving in different directions, drifting, sampling, trying things out for size. And the place you really see that, at least that I know really well, in addition to the kind of multicultural society, is that inside the kind of culture of seeking, spiritual seeking, religious, what's going to replace religion? What are we going to do next? Hedonism, we've been partying for years and it doesn't get us far. We're stuck. We need something else. What are we going to turn to? And you find this enormous explosion of spiritual paths, gurus, sects, practices, psychological seminars, Rajneesh, meditation, blah, blah, blah. And so suddenly, like, all of the countercultural people, the ones who are seeking, it's this smorgasbord. It's a multiplicity. And you're right, at the same time, there are new forms of control that are entering into the picture. It's when we first start really using computer databases to track consumers. It's when the society shifts to a consumer debt economy. Remember, Nixon takes us off the gold standard. So right. In a way, the economy is like set loose. It's like, oh God, where's this thing going? Well, we can use computers to kind of not only track people, but also help produce a sort of consumer debt culture where people are kind of buying their way through different lifestyle options. Oh, you want to be kind of a swinger type? Here we go. Oh, you're into astrology? Here you go. Oh, you're a Chicano? Hey, we got stuff for you too. So it becomes, in a way, it lays the groundwork of our contemporary society. Like if I look back, it's like, obviously our contemporary society is, the origins of it are layered throughout, millennia. But the technological organization of culture and consciousness that we're sort of that's kind of driving us crazy today. To my mind, you really go back to the early 1970s, the emergence of the internet, the growth of satellites, the growth of these consumer technologies, of early kind of surveillance devices. I mean, of course, we've had surveillance farther back, but they get technologized in a certain way that really kind of lays the groundwork. And even as all of the energies of the counterculture kind of go into this emerging world, it's not like the counterculture is completely outside. Maybe that was true in 1965 or something, but it becomes part of Madison Avenue. It becomes part of culture. Culture and consciousness sort of loop around, so that today, you have something as crazy as like the titans of the most successful global corporations on the planet are going out to Burning Man and gobbling weird drugs and celebrating this Dionysian bacchanalia that looks like the acid tests in Digital Overdrive. So that is such a weird paradox if you think about the 1960s when computers were owned by IBM and straight-laced guys in suits, and then the hippies are over here playing with, analog synthesizers, and there's no connection between those worlds, or very little. And now they're like, and we're like, how do I define myself now? So again, I think one of the appeal of studying the 70s is that there's a distance, so we can get some sense of distance, some sense of the overall map, and yet in that mirror we see ourselves, and both the excitement and the creativity of that decentralized experience you're describing, and it's the fearsome sides of it, the scary sides of it. I mean, beyond good and evil is an exultant place to be, and it's a terrifying place to be, especially when you think about it as a general condition that everybody else gets to discover as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's, as you said, it's all about identity and how we are defining ourselves, and how interesting it is to compare removing of centralized orders with what happened with economy when Nixon got rid of gold standard. It's like the same thing has happened all around the world. I'm originally from Iran, and Iran is on fire right now, and nobody knows what's going to happen. Everybody knows that they don't like the government, but nobody knows where they're going. Nobody knows what's going to be the case. But it is the very same thing happening in the United States, that we used to look from Iran to and like, oh, that's a stable place. We want to go there and enjoy all the freedom and everything. But everything changed because of the differences of identities and how people are, at least the way that I see it, and the way that people are able to express themselves without going through middlemen. And I think it is exactly because of that this is such an interesting time, that it seems like we're experiencing the second psychedelic revolution. And I want to talk to you a little about the connection between religions and psychedelics overall, and whether or not we are going to witness the kind of coming and creation of new religions and spiritual path and spiritual practices this time, according to the kind of society that we're experiencing. John Allegro, for example, he had a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, talking about the study of nature and origins of Christianity within the fertility cults of the ancient Near East. Zoroastrians, they were munching on something called hauma, that is coming from soma, that it's a Vedic kind of a drink that apparently is responsible for creation of Hinduism. How do you see this relationship, and how do you see the creation of new ways to define ourselves on a basis of religion and spirituality, considering this new revival of psychedelic experimentation and adventurism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I won't talk about the relationship between psychedelics and the origins of religion. That's a really speculative and controversial topic, because there's a lot of sort of suggestions about things that could be, and in some cases we know that there was something, like with soma or hauma, or the drink that fueled the Eleusinian mysteries. But what was in it is a controversial topic. So let's just say that, in a more, even beyond psychedelics, that the origins of religion lie in altered states, in trance states, in dreams, in psychedelics, in group ecstasies. Okay. And then over time, they develop in all these various different ways, but there's always traces of those experiences, in even, conservative religion. So let's say conservative Christianity, like fundamentalists, anti-drug, maybe you get a little bit of wine, but they're distrustful of that. But still, if you read, even for those guys, you read the Bible, and in the first part of the book of Acts, which is what happens after Christ, gets out of the grave and takes the elevator up to heaven. So they're sitting around and they're going, what are we going to do? And then you have Pentecost happen. What happened? Pentecost, you read that and it's like, my God, that's like an acid test. Suddenly they're all together and then everyone's babbling and speaking all the languages and the fire comes down on their head and they're all like, Pentecost there's a reason that Pentecostals, which we are named for Pentecost, there's a reason that Pentecostals all around the world are by far and away the most ecstatic of Christians. They're the ones who are going in there, they're getting totally altered states. The theology is incredibly conservative, and probably some of them want to kill drug users and kill queers. And the theology is very conservative, but the practice is actually pretty wild. You find different mixtures in different religions. So there's always this problem of like, what do we do with trance states and what do they have to do with religion? In a way, they feed religion, they allow religion to get going, and then once religion's going, it sort of needs them to keep going, but then it also has to control them because they're freaky. They'll undermine your perspective. They'll turn you into a mystic. It's like, I don't need a priest. I talk to God. Fuck you. Oh, I'm sorry. Whatever. I'm going to go off and do my own thing now. So religions are always in this tension with altered states, and how do you control them? How do you provide them? How do you resist them? So what's going to happen now? Very interesting. I think that it's hard to say exactly what's going to go on with the psychedelic renaissance. It seems pretty clear there's going to be relatively widespread access to psychedelic medicine one way or another, particularly psilocybin, probably less so LSD. At the same time, I think ayahuasca is going to be more and more accepted and recognized as a valid path. It's already the case that, investment bankers from Wall Street or the city in London are, going to retreats and, saying, oh yeah, ayahuasca is another sort of, a golf club in my bag for, how to navigate the world, So it's already reached a point of mainstream kind of awareness, and I think that's just going to increase. So we are in this liberalization period of psychedelics. How is that going to manifest in terms of religion or spirituality, which aren't quite the same thing? Let's say religions are more organized, larger, more traditional, with more connections to the past. Spirituality can be any number of things, although it also has its own history. Obviously, spirituality is a big part of it. Obviously, people, if you look at around the world, people who are interested in meditation, who are interested in yoga, who are interested in these indigenous traditions, even if they're not indigenous, those people are often very interested in psychedelics, and indeed psychedelics helps fuel their speculations, their experiences. If you were into the tarot or astrology, and then you take psychedelics and you kind of trip out on astrology, it's going to get more astrological, not less. It's going to get more powerful, more enchanted, more poetic. So it's a generalized fuel for spirituality. But you asked about religion, and I think that's the most interesting and open-ended question. What are we going to see in terms of liberal forms of Christianity, let's say? Who knows? I don't know. There are little bits where you can see already things kind of gurgling along the sides. I know that there was one, he sounded like a pretty liberal Sufi guy, but there was one fatwa about ayahuasca that I can't remember the sheikh's name right now, but he laid it out there. So there's some world out there of like traditionalist Sufism that involves ayahuasca. So you're going to find these little zones. There's definitely Zen retreats that have already been done and even studied, where they take mushrooms as part of the Zen retreat, and then they've studied whether the psilocybin actually aids some of these other features of meditation, and they seem to allow people to calm down quicker, get into deeper states, things like that. So it's pretty clear that, and then ayahuasca, depending on the situation, is more or less religion. There are, explicitly religious forms of ayahuasca, like the Santo Daime, and that's one of the popular forms of it that people encounter in the West. So, I mean, it's hilarious. You have like out here where I live in the Bay Area, you have people who like look and come from like totally just like hippie, surfer, whatever, not religious at all. Like what? And then what are they doing? They're putting on black pants and white shirts and black shoes, and they're going and they're dancing like this, and they're singing songs about Mary and Jesus and stars and the jungle to, when they go to Santo Daime groups. I mean, that's religion. I mean, specifically, like we're Santo Daime, you're all singing the same songs, they're religious songs. It's all about building community. And I think that is the most interesting, whether we call it religion or not. How are psychedelics going to help us really form new and vital forms of community? Because the problem with one of the problems with the decentralized world that you describe, the beyond good and evil world, is that when it happens in the context of late capitalist consumerism, with its incredible emphasis on the individual and on self-actualization, self-improvement, self-realization. I need these things for me. It's about me. And we can trace that back to the 1970s as well. So when you have beyond good and evil and a culture of individualism, you get this problem of isolation. You get this problem of disconnection, and that makes things worse. That makes people more paranoid, makes them more angry, it makes it more volatile. It's a bummer, and religion, now we can look back and go, well, religion, it's not so great sometimes, but, there's some good things about religion. And it's true. There's some really good things about religion, the way it draws people together. It creates a common sense of purpose. If it's an ethical religion, it even though there's some, the ethics are usually mixed, don't talk about the queers, but nonetheless, there is a sort of ethical injunction that has a kind of progressive quality to it, even if it manifests in mixed ways. So I think part of our problem now is that it's pretty clear that individualism is not gonna help us get through whatever we got to go through. And when you see in terms of psychedelics, if you notice, what is the mainstream view of psychedelics? What is the most widespread commercialized view of how people take psychedelics? They go in as individuals into an office that is run by another set of individuals. Maybe there's two people who sit with them. And then as individuals, they go and lie down on their bed. They put on their eye shades. They have their trip. And maybe their trip is ecstatic and maybe it's difficult, whatever. And then that's the way you do psychedelics. That's the mainstream view. Does this remind you of anything? It's totally individualized. It's totally self-realization, self-healing, blah, blah, blah. And I have no doubt that, this stuff is great. That can be very useful for people, very helpful. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen, but the fact that that's our main imagination for it, it tells us that we don't know how to do this kind of work collectively. And so on the other side of the fence, then you have something like Burning Man, where you had all these 70,000 people go out there, and a lot of them are on drugs, and it's this crazy exploratory, spontaneous, creative, inventive, ecstatic Dionysian kind of thing, which is awesome. And it does help build community in certain ways, the community of the campmates, all the difficulty of doing that. And so in a way, I think that the fact that on the one hand, we have the guy alone taking the drug with the blind shades, and the other extreme is Burning Man, which is a kind of gesture towards a politics of community. It's just, it's not, it's good in some ways and not so good in other ways. I think there are other things in between, maybe smaller scale, but ones where people are much more woven into a kind of collective sense of being in the world. And the one that interests me the most, which you can say, I don't know if religion is the right word, is what I would call the kind of new animism. And this is the sense that's rooted, in profound spiritual experience and many sacred texts and many poetic texts and frankly, in our own childhood experience, the sense that the world is alive, that the
Hmm.
world, the objects in the world are alive. And you could be a rationalist and go, well, they're not really alive. And I'm like, okay, sure, fine. But on some level, they are because we're interacting with them. They have their own things to say. All the things in my office have histories and stories. Certain conditions produce them just as certain conditions produce me. And when I encounter them, it's an encounter. It's not just me using them. That's the rationalist view is as humans, we just use the world. But the world is also it's a world. It has its own world. The things in the world have their own world, and we're encountering them. And psychedelics really sort of inflame that kind of sense of relationality, that sense of the aliveness of things. And that there's a politics in that as well. There's a way of recognizing how embedded we are in all these different systems that are non-human and having to kind of recognize the alienness and the majesty and the confusion of our situation beyond the human, so you used to talk about beyond good and evil. Well, let's talk about beyond the human. What does it mean to really be alive and awake in a world where you recognize that you as a human are always completely embedded in all of these non-human systems, technological systems, media systems, control systems, but also air and wind and water and food and nutrients and toxins and cosmic rays. That's a very psychedelic vision, but it's also a very political vision and a very embedded ecological vision. And so I'm really interested to see forms of religiosity and spirituality that are involve psychedelics that kind of move in that direction. And then I have one more thing to say, which is that we are definitely going to see some flipped out kooky cults coming down. There's no way there's not going to be because it's so easy. If you're a psychologically unsophisticated person, meaning self-reflective, even if you're sophisticated about other people, but you're not reflective yourself, it's totally easy to believe your own BS and think that you've achieved some kind of realization. You present yourself as a realized psychedelic being. All the people who are insecure are like, oh, he knows or she knows. Let's surround him. And then you take it and then you program people unintentionally even. You say oh, we're all part of, can you see the cube? The cube that's formed between us. And you're like, yes, I see the cube, because psychedelics are so responsive to setting, to programming, essentially. They're very sensitive to that kind of stuff. So used consciously or unconsciously, it's very easy for people to get inflated and create these kind of cult-like situations. And we're totally going to see that stuff. There's no way we're going to avoid that. I just hope it doesn't get so bad that it derails the good stuff that's coming down the pike. But it's going to get very interesting pretty fast.
Matt, what you're saying resonates so much with me. I just want to mention 2 points of it. A couple of weeks ago, I celebrated the 10th year anniversary of the first time I ingested psilocybin mushroom in Vancouver, BC. And it changed my life completely. I went from being a complete militant atheist as a result of living for 23 years in Iran to becoming, I don't know, and really embrace this not knowing and just curiosity to experience rather than trying to understand. And for years, I kept hearing about ayahuasca, and we were talking about how it's a good idea to go to Peru and do it. And I ended up doing it for the first time in Florida, which is where I live now. It's all over the place. And what you were saying, the sense of community of it, that people sit overnight, at least the way that I experience it, sit overnight around a fire. The fire has its own philosophy. The smoke has its own philosophy. It can get really religious, but at the same time, it is the sense of community that has its negative, but it also has its positive. And the other thing is, one of the most interesting topics to me is how we are going to merge with our technology in a way that it's happening right now more and more, and how we are defining what it means to be human. So one of the questions that I keep asking from AI people and technologists that I invite on this show is, would you say ethics and morality is objective or subjective? If it's subjective, then how do we expect to create this new intelligence in a form of artificial intelligence if we haven't even figured out what our own values or are as a civilization?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I'm with those that fear that particularly artificial intelligence in conjunction with certain kinds of surveillance technologies and in conjunction with certain kinds of let's say, ultimately propagandistic meme control or whatever you want to call it, that is such a recipe for tyranny. It's terrifying in its implications if you put your dark science fiction imagination and you throw it in that direction, because there's certainly not anything inherently ethical about increasing the capacity to control and to understand and to pattern and to connect and predict, and all of the sort of drivers of so much of contemporary society. They're not really about ethical principles. Do I think that a sort of fully agential artificial intelligence would or would not have ethics? That's a very interesting question. I've spent a lot of time around Buddhism, and there are forms of Buddhism that really try to use logic to undermine a lot of the kind of conventional ideas that keep us locked into sort of certain egoic positions. And I sometimes fantasize, and I'm not the only one, about somehow like programming an artificial intelligence with the right like logical principles that would inevitably lead to this kind of bodhisattva compassion. I mean, it's a fun science fiction story, but I think it does suggest that we do sense that there's not going to be anything like inherent ethics that are coming out of these things just naturally, that they have, it's like they have to be part woven into whatever it is that we're doing as we seek out ethical answers. But ethics isn't looking so great out there on the global scale right
No.
now. It's like, oops, and
Yeah.
and it's so hard because I mean, for me, like it's funny because you're from Iran. I in my own life, I've met, I've hung out with, a couple dozen people from Iran. I always have a great time. I would love to go to Iran. I know that I would show up and I would have a great time. But it's also like this place of fantasy because it's probably not going to happen, at least anytime soon. But there's like this great example of the incredible richness of culture and sophistication and open-endedness and the whole. I mean, the if you want to, I don't know, secular isn't quite the right word, but let's say the free thinking culture in Tehran throughout the 20th century was remarkable, even in comparison to all these places around it. And yet, from an American mainstream perspective, what's the next to China, it's like this sort of the most like corrupt, corroded, horrible power, and then it's like just it's so awful. And you're like, look, there's so many wonderful people that are locked into this situation that we can't see, and because we can't see them, we can just project a story about crazy Iranians or whatever, and it's just to me it's like I always feel as like even geopolitically I'm pro Iran and anti Arabia and whatever. That's another discussion, but I always felt that we should have tried to been better friends with Iran for a lot of reasons. But that stuff aside, it's just, for me, it's always an example of just if only we could communicate more on a level of people, and that there was some kind of shared sense of value that would enable us to get over the inevitable differences and recognize that it's we that are being oppressed by them, on top, and instead of just projecting both ways. It's hard to describe, but
No, I totally get it. The problem with Iran, unfortunately, is that I always consider Iran to be an occupied country by the Islamic regime because they're an absolute minority. Absolute majority of people have nothing to do with them. They're very westernized. When I came to Canada, I had no culture shock. My biggest culture shock, I keep telling people, it was how Western liberals criticized me when I criticized political Islam that we all suffered under, the theocracy. But, it's just an unfortunate kind of a situation. Erik's new book is called High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s. Erik, what kind of lessons have you learned or we haven't learned from the 70s that we can use in this path that we're in at this time?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that in a way, some of the most inspiring stories of the 70s, which aren't necessarily, not exactly the ones that I'm talking about, because I'm really talking about individuals who are like plunging into the depths of the mind. But the part that I find most inspiring about the 70s is its sense of creative bricolage, and I'll explain that term. So it's a term from anthropology, and what it means is sort of using what's at hand to cobble together something new. So it's not like you can make something out of nothing. It's not like you can engineer the perfect form. It's that you take a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of this, and then collectively you kind of build something. And this was a way like a lot of communes happened in the early 1970s. Most of them didn't last that long, but for the period of time that they were living, they were fascinating experiments, and they brought people together in new ways with new ideas. And they were like the same thing, like, let's take a little of this, take a little bit of that, da da da, put it together. And in a way, the three thinkers that I look at in the book, they're all bricoleurs of the imagination, or philosophical bricoleurs. I call them garage philosophers, because they were like hacking it out in their garage. They're tinkering away. It's not like they're elites. So there's something about that quality of tinkering, of hacking, of throwing together this and that, of assembling, that is a really strong thread in the 70s that feels appropriate today in some way, although our tools are so different and how we think about the media is so different. But when I look ahead, and I really can't believe that it's predominantly inside the internet sphere, the communication sphere, the social media sphere, that we're really going to find our way back to something, or not even back, just find our way towards something that gives us a better handle on things. I just feel like it has to be in the real world, even as the real world is more difficult, it's more crowded, it's uglier, it's more surveyed. All of these, it's not so groovy, it's more poison, more dying, but it's something about being in the physical world with others in shared projects that seems to me a hopeful way to go.
Excellent. I can talk to you for hours. I know your time is precious. So what's next for you, and how our audience can follow your work?
Sure. The way to follow me is I've had the same website since the mid-1990s. It's called techgnosis.com, TECHGNOSIS. It's the name of my first book, and it's still in print, so it's one people still like to turn to. And so that's a great place to follow me. You can sign up for my mailing list. I only send one out like once a month. And as for my next steps, I have a few writing projects that, I'm not talking about right now, but they're modest, and I'm not really sure, actually. There's a number of different things that I'm thinking about. I did a podcast for almost a decade, and I needed a break. So earlier this summer, I went on hiatus, and it continues to be a hiatus. I know I'll return to podcasting in some form or another because I like it so much. But it's actually a kind of a good time for me to sort of see what's gonna come up and not just dive right back in. I think in our culture today, especially, there's this kind of tension of like, you always got to be on it. You got to be like producing, and if you don't stop and let it kind of break apart, or like just kind of throw up a wall temporarily, you're just going to follow like the kind of immediate path that you're laid out for. And that might take you somewhere interesting, but if you can afford it, temporally, mentally, whatever, and just to go, okay, wait a second, I could go there, like what's happening, what comes out of the bush, what attracts you. So I'm kind of doing that at this moment, but there's definitely going to be podcasting, events, lectures, writings, and so again, the techgnosis.com and getting on the mailing list is the best way.
Fantastic. Before I ask you the last question that I ask all my guests, is there anything else you would like to add that we haven't got a chance to talk about?
No, that's good. I'm also on Twitter. I do Erik Davis at Twitter. That's a fun one. I like Twitter. I avoid arguing on Twitter.
That's
I avoid
wise.
Trolls. I've got one or two trolls, and I've disarmed them both times. But I shouldn't say that, because that's like I'm not going to let them disarm me, whatever. But I try to like maneuver through that whole thing, and so for me it's a much more friendly and exciting place.
So let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests: that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say as the worst thing humanity has done, and what would you say is our greatest achievement?
So not the way we are, but what we've done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's the difference between, that's funny that that popped in. It's like how, what's the worst thing about human beings the way they are versus what they've done and the best thing. Uh, that's a push. We, well, uh, I think um, the the despoiling of the thoughtless despoiling of our planetary environmental situation is the worst thing from a kind of cosmic perspective. Like we've done more horrible things to other people. You could say, all the ways we've treated ourselves basically could be just as bad. But there's something more, even more thoughtless and insane uh, about that, about the environment. And then the best thing, uh, art, art. I mean, for sure. I mean, what I sometimes think that if an intelligent aliens came to our zone and was like, oh, what's of value here, they would mostly be disgusted, but they'd go, but there's some good stuff there. You got Taj Mahal, you got J.S. Bach, you got Thomas Pynchon. I mean, there's some good stuff out there. So I kind of almost feel like the human experiment, if it's going to be justified, can only really be justified in art, in the full sense, like art as in a way of living life, not just of creating objects and being the same, grubby, competitive narcissist that everybody else is. It's not just the objects, but the art as it passed away. But I still feel like both of these answers were a little not quite as it's a tough one. It's a tough one.